Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, can I start? Okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. So, good afternoon or good evening. I am Jean-Michel Fortis from the University of Paris. It is my pleasure to introduce to you James McElvenny, a colleague whom I have known for quite a few years now. James is a researcher at the Center Medien der Kooperation, or Media of Cooperation, at the University of Siegen in Germany. In the good old times where there was no social distancing, James came to Paris on the occasion of conferences on the history of linguistics, as this is the field in which we share a common interest. He is now a member of the board of Shell, the Society for the History and Epistemology of the Sciences of Language, which is Paris-based and is one of the learned societies whose activity revolves around the history of language sciences. James is also a member of the Henry Sweet Society, the British counterpart of Shell. James' first publications in history were devoted to Charles Ogden and his context, and they ushered into a book adapted from his dissertation on Ogden. James then veered toward the history of German-speaking linguistics and philosophy of language in the 19th century, a vast continent of crucial importance for us linguists, and in many ways still alive in contemporary linguistics. James has published the first critical edition of Georg von der Gabelentz Sprachwissenschaft, a text which Kosciuszko, as it were, helped resurrecting by describing it as a forerunner of Saussure ideas. In this talk, James' historical contextualization will evoke this link, but it will make it clear that Gabelentz's purview can certainly not be reduced to this role of a forerunner. The talk to follow is much centered on Gabelentz, but this is just one aspect of James' research. James has also published on Schleicher, Jespersen, the legacy of Humboldt, and on Boas, who, it may be recalled, was of German origin and steeped in German culture. Beyond the German world, James is preparing a book on the history of modern linguistics, which he has taught in Potsdam, Cambridge, and Edinburgh, where he got an assignment after being awarded the prestigious Newton International Fellowship. He has also a project of missionary descriptions of Australian languages. And lastly, and perhaps this is how you first got acquainted with James' work, James is very active in promoting the history of linguistics and through various channels, including modern media. He is the founding editor of the blog History and Philosophy of the Language Sciences, and he's the editor-in-chief of the new collection on the history and philosophy of linguistics at the Language Science Press in Berlin. But it's now time to give the floor, or better the screen, to our speaker.
Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to Aberlin for inviting me to give this talk. This is a fantastic initiative, not only as a way of combating the isolation caused by the present pandemic, but also as a way of forging new international contacts and disseminating our ideas around the world. In this talk today, I'd like to discuss some topics in the history of linguistics. The way I've decided to structure the talk is to look in detail at a particular episode in the history of linguistics and treat it as a window on the time in which it took place. The episode in question is the publication in 1894 of a short 7-page essay in the journal Indogermanische Forschungen. This essay had the title Typology of Languages, a New Task of Linguistics, and was written by the German professor of Chinese and General Linguistics, Georg von der Gabelentz. The essay was programmatic in character and proposed establishing a new subfield of linguistics to be called typology. This is a rather obscure episode in the history of linguistics. Gabelentz's paper seems not to have really been noticed at the time, and to have then been forgotten about. My aim here is not to cast this paper as an unfortunately forgotten breakthrough, or to turn its author Gabelentz into an idol who we should worship and emulate. I come to exhume Gabelentz, not to praise him. But this episode hasn't entirely escaped the attention of later linguists. It did attract some interest, but mainly as a historical curiosity. The classic paper in this vein is Franz Baum's 1991 essay on Gabelentz's typology paper. We might observe also that the Association for Linguistic Typology sees in Gabelentz an illustrious ancestor. Since 2009, the association has given out the Georg von der Gabelentz Award to recognize typologically significant descriptive grammars. This award is no doubt inspired by the whole spectrum of Gabelentz's work, however, and not just his typology essay. The program that Gabelentz sketched in his typology essay sounds very much like typology as it's understood today. And it would also seem to be the first mention in print of the term typology in a specifically linguistic sense. The fact that this term was new to linguists is visible in the paper itself. The word typology is printed in the title, the running heads, and in the journal's table of contents, not as Typologie, but as Hypologie. We know, however, that Gabelentz meant typologie, but was not able to correct the error because he died as his paper was going through the press. But in other texts by Gabelentz, such as the second edition of his magnum opus, Die Sprachwissenschaft, which was revised and expanded after his death by his nephew, based on notes that Gabelentz left behind, there's an added passage introducing the term typology under this name with the correct spelling. But the project that Gabelentz envisaged under the name of typology was not entirely new. In fact, in many ways it harkened back to old ideas in linguistics that had gone out of fashion by the end of the 19th century, when Gabelentz was writing. But Gabelentz combined these old ideas with several modern methodological proposals to bring the program up to date. So what was it that Gabelentz was actually suggesting in his typology paper? In order to understand this, we have to know something about the context in which it was written. At this time, in the last decade of the 19th century, the dominant school of linguistic scholarship was that of the neo-grammarians. They dominated the field of linguistics in the same way that the generative grammarians dominate linguistics today, or perhaps even more so the way generative grammarians dominated the field a couple of decades ago. That's to say, around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, the neo-grammarians and their followers were considered by many both inside and outside linguistics to define the field. As a linguist, you didn't have to agree with the neo-grammarians or follow their program, but if you didn't, then you'd have to most likely describe your own work by saying how it was different from theirs and why you did things differently. Neo-grammarian doctrine itself was internally quite diverse and addressed many theoretical questions about the nature of human language. But the actual practice of neo-grammarian scholarship was characterized by a certain narrowness in scope and approach. The neo-grammarians had a reputation for being interested only in sound change in the Indo-European languages, and in the formulation of sound laws to account for these changes. A major criticism that the neo-grammarians faced from their opponents was that their day-to-day practice didn't do justice to the full richness of human language and the diversity of the world's languages. The feeling was that there were many other topics, beyond sound change in the Indo-European languages, that a science of language could profitably investigate. Georg von der Gabelentz was one of these neo-grammarian critics. In his magnum opus, Die Sprachwissenschaft, he said as much. Most of us linguists have limited their work to the investigation of one or another language family, and the genealogical historical school, represented at this time primarily by the neo-grammarians, has shown such amazing progress that they deserve a certain degree of self-satisfaction. It seemed reasonable to say, progress in linguistics occurs only in this school. Others might call themselves philologists, language philosophers, or even language experts or polyglots, or whatever they like, but they shouldn't claim to be linguists and what they do to be linguistics. But whoever says this confuses the little field that they plough with the commons of a large community, or if I may put it in terms of a Chinese simile, passes judgment like someone who sits at the bottom of a well and says that the sky is small. Against this perceived narrowness, Gabelentz advocated a broader general linguistics, which he understood as the study of the human capacity for language in general, rather than the narrow focus on the features of individual languages or specific linguistic processes, such as sound change. And his project entailed looking beyond the familiar Indo-European languages to try to capture the diversity of all the languages of the world. It also entailed appealing to extra-linguistic factors in accounting for the grammatical properties of languages, such factors as the putative shared mentality or the culture of speakers, the environments in which they lived, or their racial characteristics in inverted commas. In Die Sprachwissenschaft, Gabelentz also wrote, "The goal to which general linguistics must aspire can be no other than to establish the mutual relations between national character and language. Here the mental and temperamental type, the living conditions, the level of civilization of peoples and families of peoples. There the phenomena, the forces and achievements of their languages. And between these two, equations that say, the more so on this side, the more or less so on the other." This project of Gabelentz's was a continuation, or perhaps a revival, of interests that had been more central to linguistic scholarship earlier in the 19th century, and which go back to earlier periods, in particular to the Enlightenment, before linguistics became established as a university discipline. The key figure in this connection is Wilhelm von Humboldt, who, among many other things, introduced a number of influential ideas into language scholarship in the 19th century. Humboldt's approach to language was based on the idea that language is the forming organ of thought. By this he meant that our thoughts only take on a definite shape as we articulate them in language. In fact, for Humboldt, the relation between language and thought is dialectic. That's to say, there's a continual exchange back and forth between our thoughts and our words. Our thoughts shape our words, and our words shape our thoughts. Humboldt outlined a program for applying this philosophy of language to the concrete study of languages. He divided this research into two dimensions, one that's concerned with the organism or structure of languages, and another that focuses on the development of each language's character. In practice, Humboldt's study of the structure of languages looks at grammatical features, at the syntax and morphology of languages. The study of character, on the other hand, looks at the use made of a particular language in literature. 19th century linguists were mostly interested in the study of the organism or structure of languages. Up into the middle of the 19th century, many proposals for classifying languages according to their structural properties were proposed. These schemes typically focused on the morphological forms of words, and were accompanied by various ideas about what forms allegedly say about the mentality of speakers, or in some cases, their assumed cognitive abilities. From the middle of the 19th century onwards, however, linguists turned away from these sorts of questions, which came to be considered rather speculative. Instead, a much more narrowly focused historical comparative linguistics, as practiced later by the neo-grammarians, came to the forefront. This was mostly concerned with sound changes and sound laws, as a way of tracing genealogical relations within language families, and above all in the Indo-European family. So Gabelentz was among a minority of linguists towards the end of the 19th century who continued to actively pursue these questions about differences in language structure and what they might tell us about the putative mentality and even living conditions of language speakers. Gabelentz was also very much interested in languages beyond the familiar Indo-European family. The connection of Gabelentz's work to the Humboldtian tradition, and its seemingly old-fashioned character, was something that was clear to his contemporaries. We may cite, for example, the review of the Indo-Europeanist Ludwig Sütterlin of Gabelentz's Die Sprachwissenschaft. Sütterlin wrote, "Even though its first edition came out as recently as 1891, and its second edition in 1901, Gabelentz's book seems to us like a remnant of a former time. With him dies a point of view that in the end was established by Wilhelm von Humboldt. We can see what Sütterlin meant if we turn to the parts of Gabelentz's book where he describes in detail the kind of mutual influences between language structure, mentality, and living conditions that he imagines in his typology paper. In Die Sprachwissenschaft, there's a section on the appraisal of languages. Here, Gabelentz draws parallels, for example, between what he calls Malay languages and Semitic languages. He says that Malays and Semites have different racial origins, but that their languages seem to share some structural properties. In the languages of both groups, so he claims, verb-subject word order predominates. And this, he argues, is an expression of lively sensuality, since first the speaker names the sensory impression that they've received, and then they name the cause of that impression. This sensuality is supposed to be in turn evidence of receptivity and egotism, which explains the ease with which both Malays and Semites assimilate foreign thinking and other cultural material and make it their own, as well as their desire to travel and settle in new lands. It is these qualities that make Malays and Semites such successful merchants and students, but also robbers and thieves. But if we then compare the Malays to another group of people who are supposed to have the same racial origins, then we can see differences caused by environment. Gabelentz compares the Malays with the Ural-Altaic peoples. The homeland of the Ural-Altaic peoples is in the steppes of northern and central Asia. This is an environment with harsh living conditions that forces a nomadic lifestyle on its inhabitants. Gabelentz says, "In such a school of life, man is not raised to spirited initiative, but instead to a sustainable goal-conscious energy." By contrast, the abundant tropical world of the Malays stimulates their sensuality, and the view of the far sea awakens the longing of these excitable people for travel and adventure. The herdsman, that is, the Ural-Altaic person, yields to the forces of nature. The seaman, that is, the Malay, takes up the struggle against them. The former is pressured by hardship, the latter is attracted by danger. This environmentally conditioned difference in temperament is then manifested in their languages in various ways. Just one example Gabelentz offers is the way in which the plodding Ural-Altaic speaker builds up their speech piece by piece, cause before phenomenon, subject first in the sentence, adnominal and adverbial attributes carefully placed before their heads. The sensual Malay is the opposite, verb first, other parts of the sentence later, head first, followed by attributes. So to our modern eyes, Gabelentz's descriptions of these alleged national characters look rather impressionistic and seem to rely on very simplistic, not to say racist, stereotypes. The purported links he draws between these alleged mental and temperamental characteristics and linguistic structures also don't really rise above the level of just-so stories. This is perhaps the central aspect of Gabelentz's ideas about typology that seems old-fashioned and is a throwback to the crassest and most speculative forms of earlier linguistic scholarship. But there are elements of the program that Gabelentz sketches in his typology essay and in his book Die Sprachwissenschaft that seem to anticipate the future. Looking back on Gabelentz from the perspective of the late 20th century, such historians of linguistics as Anamorpogo Davies noted an inescapable air of modernity in some of the questions Gabelentz poses about language and the way he treats these questions. One of the seemingly forward-looking aspects of Gabelentz's account is the way he talks about the structure of languages. In his typology essay, he says, "Languages are free organic structures, and because they are, and inasmuch as they are, all of their parts stand together in a necessary mutual configuration." This, of course, sounds very much like one of the central slogans of later structuralism, namely, each language forms a system where everything hangs together. This is the classic structuralist idea that every language is a self-contained synchronic system of elements that delimit one another. The dictum itself would seem to have first appeared in print in Antoine Meillet's 1903 Introduction to the Comparative Study of Indo-European Languages. But at this point, Meillet was putting forward a commonplace that it has not been possible to ignore since the memoir of Meillet's teacher, Ferdinand de Saussure, which was published in 1879. In the second edition of Gabelentz's Sprachwissenschaft, published posthumously in 1901, Gabelentz's nephew has added a new formulation of this dictum that's even closer to the classical slogan. There it says, "Every language is a system, all of whose parts hang together and work together." This insight of the internal coherence of the language system is generally considered to be one of the major breakthroughs of the structuralist revolution. The neo-grammarians of the late 19th century are often accused of treating language in an atomistic fashion. They tended to look at individual elements of languages and how these changed through time, without having a conception of the overarching system of each language at each point in time. Again, this accusation doesn't really capture the full spectrum of neo-grammarian work, but it's probably a fair criticism of general practice within the neo-grammarian community. So Gabelentz's assertion of the systematic character of languages would seem to anticipate a key feature of the structuralist revolution. But this idea isn't really original to Gabelentz either. It's another old idea from the Humboldtian tradition that he's merely continuing. As we saw earlier, Humboldt and many other language scholars throughout the 19th century spoke of the organism of languages. By this, they essentially meant that each language is an organic whole, where all the parts fit together and could not be arranged in another way without changing the whole of the language. Humboldt himself spoke frequently of the internally coherent language, by which he meant, "There are no independent units in language. Every one of its elements shows itself only as a part of the whole." The use of organism in this sense continued into the beginning of the structuralist era. In the course in general linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure, for example, we find organism and system being used interchangeably. These continuities have been known for a long time, as far back as 1945, the great neo-Kantian philosopher Ernst Cassirer pointed them out. But there is one thing about Gabelentz's organic conception of language that is rather novel, namely how he proposes to capture this organic structure. He suggests that we should use statistics. In the Typology paper, Gabelentz points out that similar grammatical traits appear to cluster across diverse languages. And these traits don't seem to have been inherited or to have diffused across languages spoken in neighboring regions. As an example of the phenomenon he has in mind, he says that many languages with ergative-absolutive case marking also tend to put their genitive modifiers before the head noun and adjectival modifiers after the head. This occurs, he says, in such diverse and far-flung languages as Basque, Tibetan, Greenlandic, and many Australian languages. Conversely, languages known to be genealogically related frequently differ significantly from one another in their grammatical traits. Here he uses the example of three language families: Indo-Chinese, Kolarisch, i.e. the Munda languages of India, and Malay. The languages in these three families are all characteristically polysyllabic and agglutinative, but there are one or two languages in each of these families that are isolating. So the deep agreement in linguistic structure in the absence of the traditional explanatory factors, and disagreement in languages that ought to be similar, suggests some other necessary connection between these traits. This is where Gabelentz's notion of languages as free organic structures comes into its own. He wants to capture the statistical distribution of these traits. In the Typology essay, he writes, "Expressed statistically, A goes with B in 3/4 of cases, B with A in perhaps 3/5 or half of cases. The correlation is not necessary, but it's more frequent than we would want to attribute to chance alone. We may suppose that we are on the trail of two sympathetic nerves, which do not work together completely regularly, and now we would like to know the place where and how they are connected, as well as the reason why this connection is sometimes disturbed." Gabelentz goes on to sketch a program for collecting the necessary data and compiling these statistics. First of all, he suggests establishing a commission that would administer a questionnaire covering all possible grammatical properties in the languages of the world. There were several existing projects of this kind that probably inspired Gabelentz. On the one hand, such techniques were already being used to collect linguistic data. The prime example in Gabelentz's immediate environment would have to be Georg Wenke's German dialect survey. In the 1870s, Wenke pioneered the technique of collecting comparative data on German dialects by sending written questionnaires to school teachers and other trusted locals in towns and villages in his native Rhineland. The questionnaires asked for equivalents of standard German words in local dialects and for their pronunciations. There were also short sentences to be translated into the local dialect. From this information, Wenke compiled atlases of dialect variation across the Rhineland. In 1879, he received the support of the Prussian Ministry of Culture to expand his project across the entire German Empire. Gabelentz himself, in fact, had some experience with government sponsorship for this kind of survey work, having been commissioned by the Colonial Department of the German Foreign Office to write the Handbook for Recording Foreign Languages, a guide to collecting basic vocabularies and grammatical information on languages in German colonial territories, which at that time included the northern half of New Guinea and several South Sea islands, as well as territories in West and East Africa. But language surveys of this kind are not the only inspiration. At this time, the main Western scientific enterprise engaged in amassing quantified human data was physical anthropology. This is the field in which the researcher goes out with calipers and tape measure to record the size and shape of the human body. The aim was to come up with sets of physical measurements that would define each human racial type. When Gabelentz wrote his typology essay in the early 1890s, physical anthropology was at its peak. And the way in which Gabelentz describes ascertaining the type of languages and their physiognomic traits through quantified data shows that physical anthropology was clearly present in his mind when he was sketching the project. European scientists, hungry for data from every part of the world, realized the opportunity that seafarers in the Navy and Merchant Marine had to make scientific observations on their voyages, and secured the assistance of the authorities in their respective countries to produce manuals on making scientific observations. For example, the British Admiralty commissioned a Manual of Scientific Inquiry, first published in 1849, which contained instructions to sailors on how to make various kinds of scientific observations while travelling, mostly to do with the natural world, such as climatic records, geology, the plant and animal life, and so on. But instructions for ethnographic and physical anthropological measurements were also part of the manual. Here we see the instructions written by the British physician and anthropologist James Cowles Pritchard on how to take body measurements, in particular skull measurements, to determine the various assumed human types. In Gabelentz's immediate environment, we may mention the German imitation of the British Admiralty's manual, the instructions for scientific observations on travels, produced by a team of German scientists with the support of the German Admiralty. The first edition appeared in 1875 and contained an article by the medical researcher and physical anthropologist Rudolf Virchow, based on earlier instructions that he had published in 1872, under the auspices of the Berlin Society for Anthropology, Ethnology and Prehistory. Here you can see Virchow with his collection of skeletons. Virchow's the one who has both skin and bones. In his instructions, Virchow provided a long list of body measurements to take and various indices to calculate based on these. Here you can see a diagram from the 1888 edition of Virchow's instructions to travellers, illustrating the various measurements he'd like to be taken. In Germany itself, Virchow had overseen a physical anthropology survey of all school children with the aim of identifying the races that made up the German nation. The results, published in 1886, in fact led to the conclusion that there were no identifiable distinct races in Germany. In fact, we should note at this point that the failure to find a set of data that would define distinct races was a recurring problem for physical anthropology and other similar enterprises in this era. Over time, it became apparent to its practitioners that physical anthropology was not a tenable scientific pursuit, although there were scientists who engaged in all seriousness in physical anthropology up until the end of the Second World War. And scientific racism, in various guises, is always lurking, sometimes at the fringes of the academy, and often right in the middle of it. After collecting this precise survey data from the languages of the world, Gabelentz says, we can move on to the second stage in his typology program. This is applying what he calls the statistics of conjunctures to the data, which will provide a mechanical means of capturing an ironclad scientific image of the structure of the world's languages. In the typology essay, he writes, "The second step is purely mechanical, the statistics of conjunctures, which I briefly demonstrated above. Through this technique, we'll arrive in an irreproachably exact way at the knowledge of truly typical traits. What we have long suspected, what I have myself tried to show in isolated examples in my book, Die Sprachwissenschaft, those predominating tendencies that manifest themselves in the most diverse facets of the life of language, they will now really be calibrated according to their content and value, in numbers, as if they were weights and measures. The ground would now be cleared for a truly valuable calculation of probability. From a dozen known properties of a language, we would be able to conclude with certainty 100 others. The typical traits, the ruling tendencies, would lie clear before our eyes." What Gabelentz has in mind when he says the statistics of conjunctures sounds very much like what was being keenly discussed in these years as correlation. Correlation as a statistical term had just been introduced by Francis Galton around 1890. As is well known, Galton was a pioneer of statistical analysis. His statistical research was tied mostly to questions of the hereditary properties of various characteristics in humans. Galton was a keen eugenicist. In fact, he coined the term eugenics in his 1883 book, Inquiries into Human Faculty, although his first book-length foray into these questions was his 1869 Hereditary Genius. Let me just take a moment to observe that eugenics, like physical anthropology, is another one of these 19th and early 20th century scientific fields that many of us would look back on with embarrassment and horror. Of course, we can't simply pass anachronistic judgments on the historical figures we investigate. We have to make an effort to understand the past. Galton was not a proto-Nazi, but he's also not a poor, misunderstood pure scientist whose ideas were later perverted. There's a serious case to be made that much of what Galton envisaged under the rubric of eugenics is self-serving mid-19th century English bourgeois ideology dressed up as science. And Galton was not without his critics in his own time who said as much. In the last years of the 1880s, Galton noticed that the various methods of regression analysis he had employed in his studies of heredity could be seen as specific cases of correlation, and introduced this term to describe the relationship. By correlation, he meant that it's possible to find two properties in a set of data that co-vary predictably, and these can then be used to predict one property from the other, and, more importantly, that the correlation probably indicates a common cause for both of them. But even before Galton came up with the general concept of correlation, statisticians had been striving for ways to capture the clusters of statistical information that define types. The classical work in this direction is that of the Belgian astronomer and statistician Adolphe Quetelet, whose ultimate goal in his statistical research was to discover the average man. In physical anthropology, statistical methods were applied to identify the clusters of traits that could be used to define the types of putative human races. For example, we may mention the German statistician Wilhelm Lexis, who drew on Galton's work on determining statistical distributions around the average. In 1877, Lexis wrote that, "I believe that this method can be made fruitful, particularly in ethnography. In the variations of organic races and species, we can in general assume the presence of a type that is disturbed by chance. Lexer says that if we sort a group of people according to how typical they are, we'll find in the middle one person who embodies the type of the tribe, and people on either side who vary from this type within the boundaries of statistical significance. So Galton's general notion of correlation at the end of the 1880s was his great conceptual breakthrough that united much of his earlier work. If we follow Theodore Porter in his classic The Rise of Statistical Thinking, we can say that Galton chose the term correlation because of its traditional use to describe inheritance in biology. The great French comparative anatomist Georges Cuvier, in particular, referred to the principle of correlation in his work in comparative anatomy, by which he meant the necessary relationships between the interlocking parts of the closed system of living organisms. Gabelentz, in fact, mentions Cuvier by name in his Typology essay in this connection. And Cuvier had served as an important inspiration to the project of comparative linguistics throughout the whole of the 19th century. Friedrich Schlegel, who was instrumental in kicking off historical comparative grammar and the kind of typology pursued by Humboldt and his followers, coined the term comparative grammar on the model of comparative anatomy. This analogy between comparative anatomy and comparative grammar became part of the general background to language study in the 19th century. And statistical approaches were not unknown within disciplinary linguistics itself. The American linguist William Dwight Whitney, for example, introduced what we might describe as a variationist perspective on sound change. He imagined that there's always diversity in the speech community, that different speakers will produce slightly different sounds. Sound change then happens when the balance between variants changes, and one sound becomes more frequent than another. In order to gather empirical data in support of this hypothesis, Whitney counted the occurrence of sounds in corpora of various Indo-European languages, from Sanskrit to historical varieties of Germanic to modern English. Here you can see one of Whitney's tables showing the frequency of various sounds in modern English. From these tables, he was able to identify tendencies in the diachronic development of sounds. For example, he identified a tendency in the history of Indo-European languages to gradually reduce the openness of vowels. But to be honest, Whitney's approach doesn't exhibit much in the way of mathematical sophistication. He doesn't use any of the new techniques of modeling distributions or fitting lines of regression. This sort of frequency counting already had a fairly well-established tradition with practical applications in the development of stenographic systems. When designing these systems, it was useful to know what letters or letter combinations were most common so that the simplest and quickest ways of writing them could be devised. This principle was applied also in developing Morse code, for instance, where the most frequent letters have the shortest codes and the least frequent the longest. But one major difference between this application of statistics to language and what Gabelentz envisaged in his typology essay is that the tabulation of letters and sounds is atomistic. Each sound or letter is treated as an individual without a broader conception of the organism or system of the language into which it fits. There's no attempt to capture structural dependencies. A statistical conception of scientific laws was becoming increasingly widespread towards the end of the 19th century, even in such hard sciences as physics, where, for example, statistical methods were used to model the distribution of gases. Statistical approaches were also widespread in such human sciences as psychology. In linguistics, however, the neo-grammarians were famous for the slogan that sound laws admit of no exceptions, a slogan that's subject to some misunderstanding. As the historian of linguistics Leah Formagari has pointed out, the eminent German psychologist Wilhelm Wundt urged the neo-grammarians to take a more statistical approach to the study of language. He argued that rather than insisting on the application of absolute laws in language change, it might be more profitable to look to statistical tendencies. Gabelentz, in fact, attempted to model sound change on a statistical basis in an ill-fated effort to set up a genealogical link between the isolate language Basque, spoken in the Pyrenees in Europe, and the Afro-Asiatic language Berber, spoken in North Africa. Gabelentz argued that the sound correspondences between the languages were unstable and should be determined statistically and not in absolute terms. This effort on the part of Gabelentz was widely panned, even by those who were otherwise sympathetic to his project. Essentially, there was a feeling that Gabelentz did a poor job of curating his data, that he was ignorant of the basic principles of the languages he was studying, and that his statistical methods lacked sufficient rigor. So what happened to Gabelentz's proposal for typology? Since he died in December of 1893, as his typology essay was going through the press, he of course didn't have the opportunity to work on his program any further himself. As we observed at the beginning of this talk, the typological study of languages in a general sense, that is, the study of languages according to their structural characteristics that played such a prominent role in the Humboldtian tradition, was not a central concern of the dominant neo-grammarians. But this kind of typological work did continue in anthropologically oriented strands of linguistics. The main activity in this direction took place in North America, which had its own tradition of anthropological linguistics that was in touch with the European tradition. Through the course of the 20th century, America would become the new center of linguistic scholarship in the world, as Germany had been in the 19th century. The central figure around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century is Franz Baum, who was from Germany and had received his education there, and who built up anthropology, with linguistics as one of its subfields, in North America. Boas and his students were great critics of old assumptions about there being different evolutionary stages represented in human cultures and languages. They insisted on the equality of all languages and cultures, and didn't indulge in the kind of generalizations based on cheesy stereotypes that we saw Gabelentz deploying earlier. However, the Boasians did maintain an interest in identifying different types of languages. These ideas find clearest expression in the work of Edward Sapir, a student of Boas. In Chapter 6 of his 1921 book, Language, he introduces a fine-grained system for the typological analysis of languages, which follows on from the systems proposed in the 19th century. But to actually find an effort to implement something like the broad-based statistical program Gabelentz sketched in his 1894 paper, we have to wait until the next generation, until the work of Joseph Greenberg in the mid-20th century. Greenberg took the step of actually surveying a range of languages and compiling tables of their structural properties, quantifying the relations between them and crunching the numbers. Here's an example from one of Greenberg's earliest published works in this vein. The table shows, over a sample of 30 languages, the correlation of dominant VSO, SVO, or SOV word order with the features of whether a language has postpositions or prepositions, and whether an adjective normally precedes the head noun or follows it. From this data, Greenberg argued, we can state a number of universals, such as languages with dominant VSO order are always prepositional, and with overwhelmingly greater than chance frequency, languages with normal SOV order are postpositional. But Greenberg's efforts would not seem to have been inspired by Gabelentz's proposal at all. In fact, Greenberg, who was very well informed about the history of linguistics, seems not to have been aware of Gabelentz's work. Greenberg dates the first use of the term typology in a linguistic sense to around 1928, in the work of the Prague School. In this period, members of the Prague School, who were structuralists and entertained the conception of languages as interlocking systems, looked at structural dependencies within languages, most notably under the rubric of markedness. It was these Prague structuralists and American structuralists like Sapir who were the immediate influences on Greenberg. So what does this episode in the history of linguistics tell us? What is the moral to the story, if I can put it that way? We can say that Gabelentz's typology essay is a remarkable witness of its time. The essay sketches a program that combines even old hat insights from Humboldtian linguistics with a desire to employ the latest statistical methods. Its clear affinity with physical anthropology and eugenics, while these pursuits were highly fashionable at the time, makes this aspect of the project seem very strange and even distasteful to our present-day eyes. But the organic conception of language that Gabelentz perpetuates from the Humboldtian tradition, even though it was no longer at the forefront of linguistics in his time, would, within a decade, be considered one of the key insights in the structuralist revolution, which many scholars consider to be the beginning of a truly modern linguistics. Something approaching the program Gabelentz envisaged was innovated separately by Greenberg around 60 years later. So what we have to do with in Gabelentz's typology essay is a clear false start in the history of linguistics, but a fascinating one which, when we put it in context, gives us a glimpse into the thinking and practices of our predecessors. This glimpse is a good thing. The aim of this historiographic exercise is not to mine the past for forgotten ideas that we can now deploy in our language research today, or even to discover and honor the geniuses who made our field. Rather, it just lets us explore where our ideas and practices have come from, and to understand them in their context. This enriches our perspective on where we've come from and who we are, what we do and think, and why we do it like that. This exercise can also help to reveal and perhaps even allow us to critically question the assumptions that we make and the certainties that we take for granted as we engage in our own work as linguists. If you've made it this far through the presentation, then I think we can assume that you're interested in the history of linguistics. As they say on the internet, people who like this talk also like the website hifilangsi.net. If you want to pursue the history of linguistics further, I suggest you take a look at the website, which is a central point for news in the field and a venue for discussion. We also have a podcast. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you for this contribution to understanding the background to Gabelentz's views and also the ideas that were around at the time.
I can't see you, Jean-Michel.
Huh?
I can't see you, Jean-Michel.
It seems that I can't open. Ah, yes.
Ah, there you are.
So do we have questions from the audience? Not yet, so maybe I may start with the first question. The notion of system in Gabelentz seems to be quite different from later structuralism and Saussure's notion of system, if only because he seems to be much preoccupied with syntax. And
the Gabelentz appears to be preoccupied with syntax, you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
Perhaps more than was usual at the time, I think. I mean, what we understand as syntax now today.
But do you think that in Gabelentz's pronouncements on the notion of system that I mean, it's true that Gabelentz did a lot of work on syntax separately, but does that feed directly into into what he says about language systems?
His proposed statistical universals seem to make reference to syntax.
Yeah, that's true. Although those are just so the examples that I had in the talk just then is only a tiny sample of all of the things that he talks about in Die Sprachwissenschaft. Yeah. So there are other sorts of universals as well that are not specifically syntactic.
And so we don't have questions. I have another question about. I'm waiting for. I have another question about the the notion of word order. There were speculations in during the Enlightenment, as you alluded to it during your talk, on word orders, on the natural word order, and so on. But in Condillac, for instance, the verb first or the adjective first, those were supposedly related to the faculty of imagination more than reason, rather than the conventional order subject first and verb second. But it seems that in the German context, that those speculations were sort of led to a sort of hypostatization of a mentality, of a people's mentality. What do you think? I mean, for instance, was Gabelentz aware of what was his culture? Was he aware of people like Condillac of studies dating from the Enlightenment, or
so
was he more oriented toward sort of anthropology?
So Gabelentz, Gabelentz never actually studied linguistics as a university subject. His university training was actually in law and administration. But of course, he had a general undergraduate university education, which included courses on things like the history of philosophy. And we know from various materials that his family has collected that Gabelentz was interested in the history of philosophy. But the specific points that Gabelentz makes, I think that they're more kind of like, how would you put it? It's kind of like the folk wisdom of linguists, of German 19th century linguists. Like, I don't think that he's really thought any of it through in any great detail. They're just sort of anecdotes that he tells. So I think that, you can tell from the tone of the book, Die Sprachwissenschaft, which is where most of these examples were drawn from and where he develops these ideas most, that it's developed from his lectures. It's got a very sort of talkative tone. So it's not a treatise that's worked out in detail. It's just very suggestive of the direction that research could go in. And that is the character of a lot of Gabelentz's work.
And we have a question from Luca Debal on the relation between the universals of language in Gabelentz's view, could they be considered leading to understanding of cognitive processes? What is the relation to psychology?
Yeah, what is the relation to psychology? Yeah, so I think that... Sorry, go on.
Yeah, between his proposed universals and as supposedly leading to a better understanding of cognitive processes.
Yeah. So again, I think that this is a case where Gabelentz hasn't really thought about it that deeply. But what we can say is that the specific connections to other scholarship happening at the time that Gabelentz had was in particular to Völkerpsychologie, which was a particular approach to doing psychology developed above all by Steinthal, who was a major interpreter of Humboldt. And Steinthal didn't get mentioned verbally in that talk, although there was the frontispiece of one of his books where Steinthal developed the Humboldt's ideas about different grammatical processes in languages. Steinthal developed these into a typology where you can characterize languages and connect these to various different kinds of mentalities of people. So Völkerpsychologie is, the psychology of peoples. And I think that what Gabelentz is doing is continuing that kind of work. Although Gabelentz himself later on took a few steps back from Völkerpsychologie and didn't want to associate himself with it too closely. But his earliest publications were actually in the journal for Völkerpsychologie. So in terms of, to answer the specific question about cognitive processes, I think Gabelentz is mostly interested in talking about these characteristics of languages to find a way to characterize the mental differences between people or between groups of people, and is not so much interested in universals of human cognition. I think that's fair to say.
And James, we have a question from Phil. Chloe is asking, how would you understand that Gabelentz has been a secondary figure in the history of linguistics?
A secondary figure?
Well, you seem to say at the end of your talk that Gabelentz was not that influential, right? Or if I'm not, unless I misunderstood you, but.
No, I think that is a very, I think that's an acceptable and valid interpretation of what I said. So, I think, so Gabelentz himself, the reception of his work was not very wide-ranging. Like at the time, no one really read what he had to say. He was not one of the main influential teachers who produced, a dynasty or a school. That may have partly to do with the fact that he died relatively early on, before he sort of reached the peak of his career. But also, if you look at the way that his contemporaries talk about him, sort of other professors in linguistics and psychology and anthropology, other disciplines taught in the German university system at that time, a lot of them thought that he was a bit of an amateur. However, later on, so you mentioned Cosseriu in your introduction. Cosseriu wrote a few things in the 60s and 70s, but most notably his paper in Word, which I think was 1967, where Cosseriu claimed that Gabelentz anticipated basically everything that Saussure said in the course, which is, I think it's fair to say, is a bit of an exaggeration, and perhaps what Cosseriu was picking up on, and there's been a subsequent debate on this, but what Cosseriu was picking up on was that Gabelentz and Saussure were talking about similar ideas that were in the air, so to speak. So I think it's fair to say that Gabelentz is a secondary figure in the sense that no one really read him at the time, like he didn't establish any school. However, the reason that he could be taken to be interesting, and the reason why I have spent so much time working on him and decided to devote an entire 45-minute talk to him, is that he is a really good representative of a lot of the discussions that were happening at that time, and a very approachable representative too, precisely because he writes in this very impressionistic, suggestive way. And because he's not so careful, he says stuff that other scholars might have been more cautious in putting forward, or have put forward in a much more academic way that is, less attractive.
We have a question from Martin Konvichka, who asked about the relation of Gabelentz school. In what way the typologists were following up von der Gabelentz's proposal? Were they beginning anew completely from scratch? What's your opinion about the relation with the...
Yeah, so I don't think that, so the Prague school linguists, I don't think that they were beginning from scratch. Like, I think that they had, they had exactly the same sort of background that Gabelentz had, and they were building on these sorts of ideas. But I don't think that they were directly inspired by Gabelentz's texts. But you do see, so I mentioned that that Greenberg, for example, later on seemed not to have been aware of Gabelentz's typology essay. However, there are isolated references in Greenberg and in members of the Prague school before him to various other things that Gabelentz wrote, in particular Gabelentz's work on Chinese. He was primarily a sinologist and wrote a grammar of Chinese that was published in 1881, I believe. I'm not sure about the year, but early 1880s. And Gabelentz also did a lot of work on syntax, as you mentioned. And you see that this other work does get explicitly mentioned by Prague school linguists and even by people like Greenberg much later on. But this specific instance of Gabelentz's typology essay, and even the relevant passages in Die Sprachwissenschaft, seem not to have been picked up, or at least they're never cited explicitly. And because it was already a bit, especially the sort of impressionistic way that Gabelentz writes in Die Sprachwissenschaft, because it's already, a bit old-fashioned and perhaps even a bit embarrassing, maybe that, I mean, we can only speculate, but maybe that played a role in people not wanting to cite it directly, even if they had read it and even if it perhaps offered some sort of inspiration.
A question from Italo Almeida. James, you have mentioned the word linguist, but is it related to the question of biology? What's the real...
Gabelentz's work, sorry, it broke up a little bit there. Is Gabelentz's work related to Cuvier's comparative anatomy?
In what way is it really related to Cuvier or...
So I think this is another case where Gabelentz himself had no direct interaction with comparative anatomy, but it formed part of the general background to how linguistics was done in the 19th century. So I think he probably knew it from there. And I also drew all of those connections with like physical anthropology, which is biologically oriented in the sense that it's all about measuring the physical human body. And also Galton's work in eugenics. So I think that even though Gabelentz would not have studied any of these directly and wouldn't have been part of the research community that was actively working in these fields, because he was, an educated upper class person and indeed a university professor, he would have been in direct contact with the people who were doing this sort of work. They had, it was common. I mean, even today, professors meet with each other and, have their little discussion circles. I mean, I don't get invited to these sorts of things. I'm not a professor, but I know about these sorts of things. And that was definitely a feature of academic life in the late 19th century as well. And it's also just something that, that any educated person would have known from reading the popular press.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any other? No, I think we don't have any other question.
Oh.
Just to come back to the possible link between or to the unattested link between Gabelentz and Greenberg. There is also Schmidt, the one who wrote.
So I actually had a little bit about Schmidt, and I cut that out of the talk. But sorry, I interrupted you. Please go on.
No, go ahead. What do you think?
So Schmidt cites Gabelentz quite a bit, and Greenberg cites Schmidt quite a bit. And there are things in Schmidt that are Gabelentzy, such as most prominently, Schmidt talks about Kulturkreise, like circles of culture, which is not exactly the same sort of notion that Gabelentz had with, the direct influence of mentality on linguistic structure. But Schmidt has this idea that certain grammatical structures are signs that the speakers of those languages belong to the same sort of Kulturkreis. So they might have a sort of matriarchy, and that gives them a certain position of heads and dependents in clauses and so on. And Greenberg cites Schmidt quite a lot, mostly for the structural features that Schmidt talks about. So Greenberg is not interested in this Kulturkreis idea. And Schmidt in turn cites Gabelentz. So there is a line running through there with the concrete data that the people are working with, that these scholars are working with.
You may say just a word to people who are not familiar with Schmidt. Who is Schmidt?
Oh, well, he was a Catholic ethnologist, I guess you could say, who wrote several books tracing the language families of the world and how these intersect with this idea of Kulturkreise, cultural circles.
Oh, 1920s, right? His book.
Yeah.
Later.
So that's when most of his publications came out.
I think we don't have any other question. Miguel?
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much, Jean-Michel and James for your presentation and Jean-Michel for hosting the session. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.